Holy God, open our eyes to your presence, open our ears to your call, open our hearts to your love. Amen. Please be seated. I can only imagine what Samuel was thinking when the group of elders gathered to meet with him. He had to have known that this was not going to be pleasant. People don't just band together like this in order to tell someone what a good job they're doing. People only rally their supporters, their troops, for one reason: to go on the offensive. This meeting with Samuel was an ambush. He must have known that. The elders may have sent ahead a good word about coming for a conference or a visioning session in Ramah to discuss the future of the faith, but everyone knew it was going to be a confrontation with Samuel. Everyone knew because everyone came. People show up for a fight. They don't show up nearly as enthusiastically for a visioning session. This I can tell you from personal experience. But you don't need my story. Samuel's is so much juicier. According to the text, all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us, like other nations." According to the text, the elders wasted no time getting to the point. They all gathered together determinedly and came to Samuel at Ramah. Ramah, by the way, means elevated or sublime. They came up to Samuel at this raised place and then immediately stooped to a new low by both insulting Samuel and his offspring. "Samuel, you are old. You're old and your sons are jerks. Samuel, you're so old and your sons are so dumb that there are rocks on this mountain both younger than you and smarter than they are. Samuel, you're so old." Well, never mind. In my imagination, the litany of insults goes on for a while. Oh, but all joking aside, what I find interesting about this text is not that a crowd of people are being mean to Samuel, because that's not really remarkable, is it? There's nothing new about the righteously indignant gathering together and behaving inappropriately. That happens all the time. What's interesting to me is how this wise man of God responds. Even though Samuel is clearly wounded by their words, he does not get defensive. And he does not sink to their level, meeting insult with insult. Nor does he, and this is important especially for women to pay attention to, nor does he self-deprecate, apologize, and immediately acquiesce. What Samuel does do immediately is consult with God. Take note of that and what comes next in the text. Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." God tells Samuel, it's not about you. It's not about you. This is almost always the case when people are angry. Are you taking notes? Samuel was. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and some to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. Is this what you really want?" And the people responded, "Yes! Yes, please. This is exactly what we want. We want a sovereign who thinks and acts like us. We don't want to aspire anymore to God's expectations. We want someone who wants what we already want: power. We want to stop being afraid and start being feared." They didn't understand. They didn't understand, or they had forgotten that they were called to be a light that shines for all nations. Or maybe they just didn't care that since the call of Abraham and God's covenant with him, this notion of tribalism has never been God's plan for God's people. God called Abraham to start something completely new, to lead a group of people that would be different from all others, breaking open the ancient model of how we are to live together with our neighbors. It was a paradigm shift. This new people were called to be a blessing to all others instead of existing for their own well-being and preservation, which is what tribes normally do. Tribes exist to stay existing. What Samuel tries to tell the people is that this king they clamor for is a false idol, and following him will only end in tears. You will cry out, Samuel warns them, because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you on that day. Samuel, never being one to hold back, told it and foretold it as it was, but he could not persuade the people to live a life dedicated to love instead of fear. He could not get them to give up the self-serving desire to be great and mighty, even as it cost them from being good and godly. And this entire summer, we will witness the story unravel just as Samuel said it would. We will learn about the consequences of their putting self-serving behavior before God as we follow the trials and tribulations of King Saul, David, and Solomon. But we already know where these stories lead us. They lead us to another king, to the true king. They lead us to first century Palestine, The stories lead us to Israel under occupation by the mightiest empire to date. And because we, the people, did not learn, they led us once again to a fearful group gathered to confront or ambush one Jesus of Nazareth for talking about binding the strong man instead of trying to become the strong man. Jesus in this text was talking about binding up greed and hate and violence and all of the systemic evil that empires thrive on. This should have been good news for the people, but long ago were the days of Samuel's warning, and longer still the days of Abraham's covenant. And the people could not remember how to live another way. They could not reimagine how to live with blessing as the goal instead of oppressing. Even Jesus' family, who positioned from outside the house, outside the construct of God's intention for God's people, thought Jesus was crazy for trying to bind the strong man instead of becoming like him. And they too joined in the confrontation by the elders, the scribes, piling on for Jesus' own good, of course. But then our God, who cannot be diminished, dismantled our self-serving, membership-only, empire-building, strongman-supporting narrative and changed the paradigm to open it up at its most basic component. He opened up the most tight tribe of all, the family. Who are my mother and my brothers? Jesus asks. And looking at those who sat around him, he said, Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. May it be so with us.